On the morning of April 1st, 1942, Governor-General William Dobbie stood in his command post beneath Fort Street, Angelo, watching the island of Malta die by degrees. Above ground, the Luftwaffe's second massive raid of the day was pulverizing what remained of Valletta's stone buildings. Below, in the limestone tunnels carved deep into Malta's bedrock, Dobbie studied a supply report that contained 3 words no military commander ever wants to see: dangerous ammunition shortage. The anti-aircraft guns defending the island were firing 15 rounds per aircraft. That morning, German and Italian bombers had launched 282 separate raids. Malta's gunners had thrown everything they had into the sky, and now the magazines were nearly empty. In the harbour, Royal Navy cruisers sat at anchor with their gun barrels worn smooth from constant firing. HMS Penelope had fired so many anti-aircraft rounds that her 4-inch guns needed complete barrel replacements. HMS Aurora was down to her last 60 rounds. 60 rounds between 12 naval guns, on an island facing an average air raid every 2.5 hours. What Dobbie could not know as he read that supply report was that Malta's ammunition crisis would force the development of firing disciplines, conservation methods, and tactical innovations that would fundamentally change how anti-aircraft defense operated. The question was not whether one worker's idea could save Malta's air defense. The question was whether an entire island of gunners, engineers, and civilians could find ways to make every single round count when the alternative was watching the Mediterranean's most strategic fortress fall to an enemy who believed victory was already certain. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics of Malta's predicament were brutal and simple. On June 11th, 1940, when Italy declared war on Britain and the first Savoia Marchetti bombers appeared over Grand Harbour, Malta's entire air defence consisted of 42 anti-aircraft guns. 42 guns to defend an island that Winston Churchill himself had called an unsinkable aircraft carrier, positioned exactly in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, astride every supply route between Europe and North Africa. The Committee of Imperial Defence had recommended 172 anti-aircraft guns for Malta's adequate defence. The island had less than a quarter of that number when the siege began. The guns themselves told the story of Britain's industrial priorities in the early war years. Malta's 42 pieces were a mixed collection of 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft guns and 40mm Bofors light anti-aircraft weapons. The 3.7-inch guns, Britain's standard heavy anti-aircraft artillery, could throw a 28-pound high-explosive shell to altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet. When the shell reached the altitude set on its time fuse, it detonated, sending dozens of steel fragments through a killing radius of approximately 30 feet. The hope was that somewhere in that expanding cloud of shrapnel, a piece of jagged metal would find a vital component of an enemy aircraft. The Bofors guns operated on a different principle. Instead of exploding shells, they fired 2-pound projectiles at rates approaching 120 rounds per minute. The concept was to put so many rounds into the air that some of them would physically strike the attacking aircraft. Each Bofors gun could theoretically fire 2,000 rounds in under 20 minutes of sustained operation. In practice, barrel overheating, ammunition handling limitations, and the need for the gun crew to actually acquire and track targets meant real-world firing rates were considerably lower. Still, even at reduced rates, a single Bofors position could expend several hundred rounds during an extended air raid. Malta's 42 guns, firing at capacity during a major raid, could theoretically consume thousands of rounds in a single engagement. The problem was that Malta did not manufacture anti-aircraft ammunition. Every shell, every cartridge, every fuse had to arrive by ship from either Britain or Egypt. And in the spring of 1942, getting ships to Malta had become nearly impossible. The island's location, which made it so strategically valuable, also made it extraordinarily vulnerable. Malta sat barely 60 miles from Sicily, where the Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps II had established bases in January 1942 under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. From Sicilian airfields, German Junkers 88 bombers could reach Malta in under 30 minutes. Italian bases were even closer. When a convoy attempted to reach Malta from either the east or west, it had to pass through hundreds of miles of sea dominated by Axis air power and submarine forces. The February 1942 convoy attempt from Alexandria demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of these defences. 3 modern merchant ships, escorted by 8 Royal Navy warships and reinforced by 6 additional warships from Malta, attempted to fight through what aviators called Bomb Alley, the gauntlet between Crete and Cyrenaica, where Axis bombers could attack with impunity. None of the 3 merchant ships reached Malta. All 3 were sunk by German and Italian aircraft that pressed home their attacks despite heavy anti-aircraft fire from the escorts. The convoy crews fired thousands of rounds trying to protect the merchants. They succeeded only in proving that ammunition expenditure and successful defence were not the same thing. A March convoy fared slightly better. 3 out of 4 merchant ships reached Grand Harbour, one of them so badly damaged that it barely made it to the docks before settling onto the harbour bottom. The supplies those ships carried, including several thousand rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition, were immediately distributed to gun positions across the island. The replenishment lasted exactly 2 weeks. By mid-April, Malta was consuming ammunition faster than convoys could deliver it, assuming convoys could deliver anything at all. The April bombardment revealed the true scale of Malta's vulnerability. That month, German and Italian aircraft launched 282 major air raids on the island. 282 separate occasions when Malta's gunners manned their positions, loaded their weapons, and fired everything they could into the Mediterranean sky. The weight of bombs that fell on Malta in April 1942 exceeded 6,000 tons. For comparison, the entire London Blitz, during its peak month in October 1940, delivered approximately 9,000 tons of bombs across a target area hundreds of times larger than Malta's 122 square miles. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica were attempting to destroy Malta through sheer weight of explosives, and they were succeeding. Valletta's Royal Opera House, a landmark since the 19th century, ceased to exist after a direct hit. The 3 cities, Senglia, Vittoriosa, and Cospicua, ancient settlements clustered around Grand Harbour, were reduced to rubble. 10,000 buildings were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. 300 civilians died, and many times that number were wounded. The civilian population, which numbered 275,000, spent an average of 12 hours per day in underground shelters carved from Malta's limestone bedrock. The stone that made Malta an excellent fortress also made it a nightmare during bombardment. When high explosives struck limestone, the rock shattered into thousands of razor-sharp fragments that flew through the air like shrapnel, adding to the casualties from the bombs themselves. For the anti-aircraft gunners, April 1942 was a month-long nightmare of impossible decisions. Every time enemy aircraft appeared, which happened an average of once every 2.5 hours around the clock, gun commanders had to calculate whether to engage. Engaging meant expending ammunition that might not be replaced for weeks or months. Not engaging meant allowing enemy bombers to strike uncontested, destroying the infrastructure and supplies that made continued resistance possible. The heavy anti-aircraft guns faced particularly complex fire control problems. Each 3.7-inch shell required a time fuse to be set before firing. Crews used mechanical fuse-setting devices to adjust the fuse based on calculations of the target's altitude, speed, and predicted position when the shell reached detonation height. This process took time and required considerable skill. Fire too early, and the shell exploded harmlessly below the enemy formation. Too late, and it exploded above them. Even perfect timing provided no guarantee of a hit. A shell exploding at altitude created a killing zone, perhaps 30 feet in diameter. The bomber it was aimed at might be travelling at 200 miles per hour through air currents that could shift its position unpredictably. Hitting an aircraft with anti-aircraft fire was fundamentally a statistical problem. Fire enough shells and eventually one would detonate close enough to damage or destroy an enemy bomber. But the operative phrase was enough shells. Experienced fire control officers estimated that under typical combat conditions, it required approximately 2,000 rounds of heavy anti-aircraft ammunition to achieve a single confirmed kill against a high-altitude bomber. 2,000 rounds per kill. Malta's 42 heavy anti-aircraft guns, if they fired continuously during a major raid involving 50 enemy aircraft, might expend several thousand rounds to achieve perhaps 3 or 4 kills. The mathematics were unsustainable. The light anti-aircraft guns faced different but equally severe problems. Bofors guns were most effective against low-flying aircraft within their maximum effective range of about 6,000 feet. German and Italian tactics evolved quickly to exploit this limitation. High-altitude bombers, flying above 20,000 feet, could simply ignore the Bofors guns. Only the 3.7-inch heavy anti-aircraft could reach them, and Malta had fewer than 3 dozen of those weapons. But the Luftwaffe also employed Messerschmitt 109 fighters and Stuka dive bombers that attacked at lower altitudes, where Bofors fire could be effective. When these aircraft appeared, Bofors crews fired with desperate intensity, knowing that a single diving Stuka that penetrated the defensive barrage could put a bomb directly onto a gun position, an airfield, or a supply depot. The consumption rates during these engagements were staggering. A well-trained Bofors crew could fire 60 rounds per minute during sustained action. A 10-minute engagement, not uncommon during a determined low-altitude attack, meant each gun might fire 600 rounds. Multiply that by Malta's light anti-aircraft battery, and a single raid could consume thousands of rounds of 40mm ammunition. By late April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Denis Rollo of the Royal Malta Artillery, who would later write the definitive history of Malta's anti-aircraft defence, estimated that the island's guns were consuming approximately 15 rounds for every aircraft that appeared in Malta's airspace. 15 rounds per aircraft times 282 raids meant over 4,000 individual aircraft sorties during the month. Even assuming many of those sorties involved formations of multiple aircraft counted as single raids, the ammunition expenditure ran into tens of thousands of rounds, and the convoys that were supposed to replenish those magazines were not getting through. The situation became critical enough that on April 1st, Governor General Dobbie sent his warning to London about dangerous shortages of ammunition, along with flour, fodder, oil, and coal. The message was not hyperbole, or an attempt to gain priority for supplies. It was a simple statement of fact. Malta's ammunition reserves were approaching the point where gun positions would have to cease fire and allow enemy bombers to attack unopposed. Without ammunition, the anti-aircraft guns became expensive pieces of scrap metal. Without anti-aircraft defense, the airfields could not operate, the harbors could not function, and the submarines and aircraft that were interdicting Axis convoys to North Africa would be destroyed on the ground. General Erwin Rommel, commanding Axis forces in Libya, had stated plainly that without Malta, the Axis would lose control of North Africa. The reverse was equally true. Without resupply, Malta would lose its ability to influence the North African campaign, and the entire strategic balance in the Mediterranean would shift decisively in favour of the Axis powers. The ammunition crisis of April 1942 forced a fundamental reconsideration of how anti-aircraft defence operated on Malta. The old doctrine, developed in Britain during the 1930s and refined during the Battle of Britain, emphasised maximum firepower. When enemy aircraft appeared, every available gun opened fire, throwing the heaviest possible volume of steel into the air. This doctrine made sense when ammunition supplies were relatively secure and when engagements were separated by hours or days of recovery time. Malta, in April 1942, had neither secure supplies nor recovery time. The island was under attack nearly continuously, and every round fired was a round that might not be replaced. Something had to change, not at the level of grand strategy or industrial production, but at the level of individual gun crews making split-second decisions about when to fire and when to conserve their dwindling stocks. The solution would not come from a single brilliant innovation or one worker's breakthrough idea. It would emerge from hundreds of gunners, learning through desperate experience how to make ammunition last while still maintaining an effective defense. It would require discipline that bordered on the inhuman, the ability to watch enemy bombers overhead and not fire unless the engagement met specific criteria for probable effectiveness. And it would require accepting that some aircraft would get through, some bombs would fall unopposed, because the alternative was to empty the magazines entirely and guarantee that all future aircraft would attack without opposition. The transformation began in the gun pits themselves, where crews who had been trained to fire on any target within range now had to make calculations that mixed military necessity with resource conservation. A high-altitude bomber formation at 25,000 feet, well within the theoretical range of the 3.7-inch guns, might be allowed to pass unmolested if fire control officers determined that the formation was not heading for critical targets and that engaging would expend ammunition better saved for more threatening raids. A lone reconnaissance aircraft at extreme range might draw fire from a single gun rather than an entire battery, conserving ammunition while still demonstrating that Malta's defense remained active. Low-flying fighters that appeared without fighter escort might face concentrated Bofors fire, but only after gun commanders confirmed that the attacking aircraft were committed to their runs and could not easily evade. Tracking rounds, those first few shells fired to establish range and adjust aim, were reduced to the absolute minimum. Gun crews became expert at calculating firing solutions based on visual estimation and experience, rather than methodical range-finding that required multiple rounds to establish accuracy. The Navy vessels in Grand Harbour faced particularly acute shortages because their ammunition storage had been calculated for blue water operations, not sustained anti-aircraft defence while trapped in port. HMS Penelope, the light cruiser that had fought through multiple convoy battles and sustained mine damage before reaching Malta for repairs, found herself confined to French Creek dry dock throughout March and April 1942. During that time, she served primarily as a floating anti-aircraft platform, her 4-inch dual-purpose guns firing continuously during air raids. The crew wore out multiple gun barrels, firing so many rounds that Malta dockyard workers began calling Penelope HMS Pepperpot because her hull was so thoroughly perforated with splinter holes from near misses that she looked like a kitchen pepper shaker. When Penelope finally limped out of Malta in April, she carried barely enough ammunition to fight off a single determined air attack during her passage to Gibraltar. HMS Aurora, another cruiser that had been operating from Malta, was down to 60 rounds across all her main battery guns by late April, 60 rounds total. Her 6-inch main guns required ammunition to be offloaded entirely since they were useless for anti-aircraft work, and even her secondary battery was nearly empty. The Aurora's gun crews, like those throughout Malta's defences, had been firing at rates that no peacetime planner had considered sustainable because the alternative was to let the Luftwaffe operate uncontested. The consequences of ammunition shortage went beyond simple inability to engage targets. Gun crews, whose primary mission was to defend specific installations or areas, found themselves making impossible choices about priority targets. Should a battery engage a bomber formation heading for the airfield at Lucca, or conserve ammunition for bombers targeting the submarine pens at Manuel Island? Should light anti-aircraft guns fire on every low-flying fighter that appeared, or save their ammunition for dive bombers that posed more direct threats to ground installations? These decisions, which in normal circumstances would be made based on tactical considerations alone, now included resource calculations that would have been appropriate for a supply officer rather than a combat commander. The psychological toll on the gun crews was severe and poorly documented in official records. Gunners trained to engage any enemy within range now had to exercise restraint that went against every instinct developed during training. Watching enemy bombers fly overhead without firing, knowing that those bombers were heading to attack civilian areas or friendly positions, violated the fundamental purpose of anti-aircraft defense. Yet orders were orders, and ammunition was finite. Crews learned to recognize the difference between missions worth engaging and missions where conservation took priority. They learned to live with the knowledge that some of their countrymen would die under bombs that might have been prevented if ammunition had been unlimited. The actual innovations that helped Malta survive its ammunition crisis were less dramatic than the title question suggests, but no less important for their mundane nature. Gun positions developed improved optical tracking techniques that reduced the number of rounds needed to establish accurate firing solutions. Crews became expert at visual estimation of altitude and speed, skills that normally took months to develop but which were compressed into weeks by the desperate intensity of continuous combat. Fire control officers created informal networks to share information about enemy approach routes, formations, and tactics, allowing better coordination of defensive fire and reducing redundant engagements where multiple batteries fired at the same formation. Perhaps most significantly, Malta's anti-aircraft defense developed the practice of ammunition rationing, a formal system for allocating limited supplies based on priority targets and probable effectiveness. This was not a single innovation but a systematic approach that involved every level of command from individual gun crews to the island's overall defense coordination. Gun positions received daily ammunition allowances based on available stocks and anticipated raid intensity. Commanders who exceeded their allocation without achieving corresponding results faced questions about their fire discipline. Those who demonstrated ability to achieve kills while conserving ammunition received priority for future resupply when convoys did make it through. The rationing system remained in effect through the worst period of the siege, from April through October 1942. Only in November, after the Second Battle of El Alamein shifted the strategic situation and allowed more convoys to reach Malta, was ammunition rationing officially terminated. By that time, Malta's gunners had developed fire disciplines and conservation techniques that would influence anti-aircraft doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The transformation of Malta's anti-aircraft defense during the 1942 siege was not the result of a single worker's brilliant innovation. It was the result of thousands of gunners, fire control officers, ammunition handlers, and commanders learning through desperate necessity how to make limited resources accomplish impossible missions. Every gun crew that held fire when instinct screamed to engage, every fire control officer who calculated that a particular formation was not worth the ammunition expenditure, every commander who enforced rationing discipline despite the psychological cost, contributed to Malta's survival through its darkest period. The question posed by the title, whether one worker's idea could save Malta's air defense, misunderstands the nature of how military organizations adapt under extreme pressure. Salvation, when it came, was not delivered by a single innovation, but by the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of desperate decisions made under fire. The gunners who developed these techniques received no medals for conservation, no commendations for rounds not fired. Their contribution was measured in negative space, in aircraft that would have been engaged under normal circumstances, but were allowed to pass because the ammunition was needed more urgently elsewhere. This was not glamorous work. It was the unglamorous but essential task of making impossible mathematics somehow equal survival. On April 15, 1942, in the midst of this desperation, King George VI sent a handwritten message to the governor of Malta that would become one of the most famous citations of the war. To honour her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history. The George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for gallantry, had never been given to an entire population before. Malta became the only place in the world to receive this honour as a collective entity. The medal would not actually reach the island until May, carried by the new governor, Lord Gort, and it would not be formally presented until September 13th, when air raids had subsided enough to permit a public ceremony. But the symbolic significance was immediate and profound. Malta's people, enduring an average of 12 hours per day in underground shelters, surviving on starvation rations, watching their homes reduced to rubble, now knew that their suffering had been recognised at the highest levels of the British government. But symbols could not feed the population or load the anti-aircraft guns. By early August 1942, Malta's situation had deteriorated to the point where surrender appeared inevitable. Aviation fuel reserves had dropped to the point where only a few weeks of fighter operations remained possible. Food stocks were calculated in weeks rather than months. Ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns, despite all the conservation measures, was approaching the point where sustained defense would be impossible. The June convoy operations, known as Harpoon and Vigorous, had been catastrophic failures. From Gibraltar, 6 merchant ships had attempted to fight through to Malta, escorted by massive naval forces including battleships and aircraft carriers. Only 2 merchants reached Malta, and one of those was so badly damaged it sank in Grand Harbour before most of its cargo could be offloaded. The tanker Kentucky, Ohio's sister ship, was crippled by German air attack and then finished off by Italian cruisers. From Alexandria, 11 merchant ships attempted the eastern approach with equally disastrous results. 7 turned back under intense attack. The remaining 4 were all sunk. No fuel oil reached Malta from either convoy. The escorts themselves suffered heavy casualties, with cruisers damaged and destroyers sunk. The Admiralty recognized that one final attempt had to be made before Malta's supplies ran out completely. The operation was designated Pedestal, and it would be the largest single convoy effort of the Mediterranean War. 14 merchant ships would carry 42,000 tons of supplies, including food, ammunition, and most critically, fuel. The convoy would be protected by a naval force unprecedented in size. 2 battleships, Nelson and Rodney, 3 aircraft carriers, Eagle, Victorious, and Indomitable, 7 cruisers, and 32 destroyers. The convoy would also receive support from 7 submarines positioned to ambush Italian naval forces that might attempt to intercept. The most important single vessel in the convoy was SS Ohio, an American-built tanker that had been loaned to Britain specifically for this operation. Ohio was brand new, launched in April 1940, and completed that June. She displaced 14,000 tons fully loaded and could make 16 knots, fast for a tanker. Texaco Oil Company had built her to the highest standards, and when Britain requisitioned the vessel, American engineers had added special structural reinforcements designed to help her survive near-miss bomb explosions. Her cargo consisted of 11,000 tons of kerosene and diesel fuel, enough to keep Malta's aircraft and submarines operating for several months if it could be delivered. Command of Ohio was given to Captain Dudley Mason, a 39-year-old merchant marine officer with experience in multiple convoy battles. Mason assembled a volunteer crew of 77 men, all British, except for the ship herself, which remained under American registry. The crew understood exactly what they were volunteering for. Malta convoys had become death traps. Of the 24 merchant ships that had attempted to reach Malta in recent months, only 4 had succeeded in delivering their cargoes. The odds that Ohio would survive the passage were perhaps 1 in 4. The odds that she would survive intact were considerably lower. But the fuel she carried was so desperately needed that the mission had to be attempted regardless of the cost. The convoy assembled in the Clyde on August 2nd, 1942, and set course for Gibraltar. The merchant ship steamed in 3 parallel columns, with Ohio 4th in line in the starboard column. The massive escort force surrounded them like a steel wall, but everyone involved knew that once the convoy passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean, that wall would be tested by every weapon the Axis could bring to bear. The convoy sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar on the night of August 9th and immediately encountered the first of many disasters. On August 11th, the German submarine U-73 torpedoed the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle. 4 torpedoes struck the carrier in quick succession. Eagle rolled over and sank in 4 minutes, taking 260 men and all but 4 of her aircraft to the bottom. The loss of Eagle reduced the convoy's air cover by 1/3 before the heaviest attacks had even begun. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica had been tracking the convoy since it entered the Mediterranean, and they launched their first major attack on August 12th. 20 Junkers, 88 bombers, came in at high altitude, while a combined force of 100 German and Italian aircraft attacked at lower levels. The sky above the convoy filled with anti-aircraft fire, fighter aircraft, and the smoke trails of falling bombs. In the chaos, the Italian submarine Axum maneuvered into attack position and fired a spread of torpedoes at the merchant ships. 1 torpedo struck Ohio amidships on her starboard side. The explosion tore a massive hole in the tanker's hull and sent a pillar of flame shooting hundreds of feet into the air. Burning kerosene bubbled up from the fractured tanks, while gouts of flame spattered across the deck. Captain Mason ordered the engines shut down and called for all hands to fight the fire with deck water lines. The crew fought the blaze for over an hour, spraying water onto burning fuel while trying to avoid being caught by the flames that erupted unpredictably from the damaged cargo tanks. Somehow, through skill and desperate effort, they extinguished the fire. The damage control parties managed to isolate the ruptured tank and restore enough integrity to the hull that Ohio could get underway again. By evening on August 12th, the tanker was making 13 knots and had rejoined the convoy formation. But the respite was brief. On August 13th, the attacks intensified. 60 Stuka dive bombers focused their attention on Ohio specifically. The Germans had identified the tanker as a priority target, and they were determined to sink her. Near misses buckled her hull plates and caused her forward tank to flood with seawater. A Junkers 88, damaged by anti-aircraft fire, crashed directly onto Ohio's deck. The impact killed several crew members and started new fires. A Junkers 87 Stuka, also damaged, bounced off the water and crashed into Ohio's side. The tanker avoided mines, torpedoes, and circling torpedoes that had missed their targets and were running in circles through the convoy. Then 2 bombs straddled Ohio, detonating simultaneously on either side of her hull. The twin explosions lifted the 14,000-ton tanker completely out of the water. When she came down, her keel was broken, her boilers were blown, and she was dead in the water. It was 10:50 in the morning, and Ohio appeared to be finished. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain Mason refused to abandon ship. The cargo in Ohio's holds represented Malta's last chance for survival, and as long as the tanker remained afloat, there was a possibility of getting that cargo to Grand Harbour. The destroyers HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury moved alongside the crippled tanker and attempted to take her in tow. This was extraordinarily dangerous. Ohio was wallowing in heavy seas, her broken back causing her to flex and twist in ways that no ship should move. The tow lines parted repeatedly under the strain. Bombs continued to fall around the stationary tanker as German and Italian aircraft pressed their attacks. Other merchant ships from the convoy were sinking around them. Wimarama took a direct hit that ignited aviation gasoline stored on her deck. The ship exploded and sank, killing 80 of her 107 crew members. Dorset was disabled by near misses that flooded her engine room and set high-octane gasoline on fire. She had to be abandoned. The convoy that had started with 14 merchant ships was being whittled down with systematic efficiency, but Ohio, incredibly, remained afloat. For 3 days, August 13th through 15th, Penn and Ledbury worked to keep Ohio moving toward Malta. They rigged tow lines, then rigged them again when the lines parted. They lashed themselves alongside the tanker to provide both propulsion and buoyancy, essentially turning 3 ships into a single floating entity that could barely make 5 knots. Spitfires from Malta provided air cover as the battered convoy approached the island, but the attacks continued. A bomb hit Ohio in the same area where she had been torpedoed earlier, compounding the damage. Her keel, already broken, fractured further. The tanker began to settle lower in the water as internal bulkheads failed and compartments flooded. By the morning of August 15th, Ohio's deck was nearly awash. She was more submarine than ship, held together by the destroyers lashed to her sides and by the desperate determination of her crew who refused to accept that their mission had failed. At 9:30 in the morning, on August 15th, 1942, the feast day of Santa Maria, Ohio entered Grand Harbour, escorted by Penn and Ledbury, and preceded by the 3 merchant ships that had survived the gauntlet. Crowds lined the harbour walls, many of them openly weeping as they watched the shattered tanker approach. A band played Rule Britannia, but as Ohio came into view, the music stopped. The crowd fell silent. Men removed their hats, women crossed themselves. A bugle sounded. Still, the traditional military honor for the fallen. Ohio settled onto the harbor bottom as lines were secured to the dock, but her cargo was intact. The tanker discharged her 11,000 tons of fuel into waiting oilers over the next several days, with water being pumped into her tanks simultaneously to prevent structural collapse as the weight was removed. When the last of the fuel had been transferred, Ohio settled completely, her broken back finally giving way. She would never sail again. The strategic impact of Operation Pedestal was immediate and decisive. Of the 14 merchant ships that started the voyage, 5 reached Malta, including Ohio. Those 5 ships delivered 32,000 tons of supplies. Ohio's 11,000 tons of fuel alone ensured that Malta's aircraft and submarines could resume offensive operations against Axis convoys to North Africa. In August 1942, while Malta was still technically under siege, 35% of Axis convoys attempting to reach Libya failed to arrive. In September, with Malta resupplied and her strike forces back in action, Allied submarines and aircraft sank 100,000 tons of Axis shipping, including 24,000 tons of fuel destined for General Erwin Rommel's forces in Egypt. This left Rommel desperately short of supplies during his assault at El Alamein in late October. The fuel that Ohio delivered to Malta in August helped ensure that Rommel's offensive failed in November. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on October 23, 1942, marked the turning point of the North African campaign. Rommel's forces, starved of fuel and supplies by Malta-based interdiction, could not sustain their defence against overwhelming Allied superiority. The German and Italian armies began a retreat that would end 8 months later with complete Axis defeat in North Africa. Malta's role in that defeat was central and decisive, and Malta's ability to play that role depended entirely on the supplies delivered by Operation Pedestal. The ammunition conservation measures developed during the April through August period remained in effect through the autumn, even as supply conditions gradually improved. Gun crews had learned lessons about fire discipline and resource management that proved valuable throughout the remainder of the war. The techniques developed on Malta, formal ammunition rationing, priority targeting systems, improved fire control coordination, and psychological training to help gunners accept that not every target could be engaged, were studied and implemented at other defensive positions facing ammunition shortages. The innovation was not technological. No one invented a new weapon or developed a more efficient anti-aircraft shell. The innovation was organizational and psychological, finding ways to make human beings operate effectively under constraints that traditional doctrine said were unacceptable. This type of innovation rarely appears in histories focused on dramatic breakthroughs or heroic individuals. There are no patents for ammunition rationing systems, no medals for fire control officers who chose not to engage. But the cumulative impact of thousands of small, disciplined decisions made under extreme pressure by people who understood that survival depended on making every round count was as significant as any technological advance. The statistics that emerged from Malta's defense tell a story that numbers alone cannot fully capture. During the period from January through July 1942, Malta endured 154 days of continuous day and night bombing. During those 154 days, there was only one 24-hour period without bombs falling on the island. 3,340 air raids were recorded during the full siege period, from 1940 through 1942. Over 15,000 tons of bombs fell on 122 square miles. 10,761 buildings were destroyed completely. 1,581 civilians were killed, and many thousands more were wounded. The civilian population suffered from malnutrition-related diseases, scurvy, rickets, tuberculosis, and a range of conditions caused by prolonged underground living in unsanitary conditions. Yet Malta never surrendered. The question of why has occupied military historians for decades. The George Cross certainly provided symbolic recognition that boosted morale. Operation Pedestal definitely provided the material means to continue resistance. But between the symbolic gesture in April and the practical relief in August lay 4 months of desperate improvisation, during which Malta's defenders had to make do with resources that were clearly inadequate for the mission they faced. The ammunition conservation story represents one element of that improvisation. Gun crews learned to identify which targets represented genuine threats and which could be allowed to pass. Fire control officers developed informal networks to coordinate defensive fire and prevent redundant engagements. Commanders enforced rationing discipline, despite the psychological cost of watching some enemy aircraft attack unopposed. Civilian workers in the ammunition depots developed more efficient handling procedures to reduce waste and ensure that every round reached the guns. Maintenance crews found ways to extend the service life of gun barrels and equipment despite operating under conditions that would normally require frequent replacement of worn components. All of these adaptations were small-scale, undramatic, and largely undocumented in official records. But collectively, they made the difference between a defense that collapsed under unsustainable consumption rates and one that held together long enough for relief to arrive. The long-term legacy of Malta's siege can be measured in multiple dimensions. Strategically, Malta's survival ensured that the Mediterranean remained contested rather than becoming an Axis lake. This forced Germany and Italy to divert resources, aircraft, ships, and supplies to protecting their North African supply lines when those resources might have been used elsewhere. The interdiction of Axis convoys by Malta-based forces directly contributed to Allied victory in North Africa, which in turn enabled the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and Italy in September. The entire southern approach to Hitler's Fortress Europe depended on maintaining Malta as an offensive base. Tactically, Malta provided a laboratory for developing defensive techniques under extreme resource constraints. The ammunition conservation measures, the fire discipline procedures, the priority targeting systems, all found applications in other theatres where supply difficulties made traditional defensive doctrine impractical. The psychological training needed to help gunners accept that not every target could be engaged proved valuable in numerous situations where limited resources required difficult choices about when to fight and when to conserve. For the individuals who lived through the siege, the experience left marks that lasted lifetimes. Gunners who had learned to calculate ammunition expenditure as carefully as their fathers might have calculated household budgets carried that discipline forward. The ability to make life or death decisions under extreme pressure, to maintain focus and professionalism when exhaustion and fear made such focus nearly impossible, became part of their identity. Many veterans of Malta's defense spoke in later years about the peculiar clarity that came from fighting with inadequate resources. When every round matters, when there are no reserves to fall back on, when failure means not just military defeat, but the starvation of an entire civilian population, decisions become simultaneously simpler and more difficult. Simpler because the constraints are absolute. You cannot fire more ammunition than you possess. More difficult because every decision to engage or not engage carries consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The civilian population that endured the siege developed similar perspectives. Maltese citizens who had survived on starvation rations, who had spent months living underground, who had watched their homes destroyed and their neighbours killed, emerged from the experience with a profound understanding of what endurance meant. The George Cross that King George VI awarded to the island in April 1942 remains part of Malta's flag to this day, a permanent reminder of what the island's people survived. The medal itself is displayed in the National War Museum in Fort Street, Elmo in Valletta, alongside artifacts from the siege, including components from Ohio and other convoy ships. Every year on August 15th, Malta commemorates the arrival of the Santa Maria convoy with ceremonies that remember both those who died and those who survived. Captain Dudley Mason received the George Cross for his command of Ohio during Operation Pedestal, one of only a handful of merchant marine officers to receive Britain's highest civilian award for gallantry. 23 members of Ohio's crew received various decorations for their roles in keeping the shattered tanker afloat long enough to deliver her cargo. But most of the men and women who contributed to Malta's defence received no formal recognition. The gunners who held fire when every instinct urged them to engage, the ammunition handlers who developed more efficient procedures, the fire control officers who coordinated defensive fire with minimal resources, the civilian workers who kept the defense infrastructure functioning despite malnutrition and exhaustion, all performed essential roles that were too diffuse, too continuous, and too unglamorous to generate individual citations. This points to a broader truth about military operations that popular histories often obscure. Victory in war depends less on brilliant individual innovations than on sustained, competent performance by large numbers of people operating under difficult conditions. The transformation of Malta's anti-aircraft defense during the 1942 siege was not the result of a single factory worker's idea that quadrupled output. There was no quadrupling of output. Malta never manufactured ammunition locally. Every round had to arrive by convoy, and the convoys were failing more often than they succeeded. What actually happened was that Malta's defenders learned to make inadequate supplies accomplish missions that required adequate supplies. They did this through discipline, coordination, improvisation, and the acceptance of risk that peacetime doctrine would have considered unacceptable. They did this knowing that failure meant not just their own deaths, but the surrender of an entire island and the strategic consequences that would follow. The title question, whether one worker's idea saved Malta's air defense, reflects a common desire to find simple narratives in complex historical events. We want to believe that major outcomes flow from individual genius, that one person's breakthrough can change the course of battles and wars. Sometimes this is true. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park, radar developers in Britain, scientists working on the Manhattan Project, all made contributions that can be traced to specific individuals or small teams. But most military operations succeed or fail based on the accumulated performance of thousands of people whose individual contributions are too small or too ordinary to merit individual recognition. Malta survived because British and American shipyards built convoy escorts faster than the Axis could sink them. Because British and Commonwealth sailors kept sailing those escorts into the Mediterranean despite casualty rates that approached 50%. Because Maltese dock workers unloaded ships while bombs fell around them. Because gunners fired only when fire would be effective and held fire when conservation was more important. Because pilots flew Spitfires off carrier decks and into immediate combat with fuel reserves measured in minutes. Because submarine crews attacked Axis convoys knowing that the Mediterranean in 1942 was a death trap for submarines. Because none of these people quit when quitting would have been entirely rational and justifiable. The unglamorous nature of this achievement does not make it less significant. If anything, the opposite is true. A defense that depended on one person's brilliant innovation would have been fragile, vulnerable to the loss of that one person or the failure of that one innovation. A defense that depended on thousands of people performing their duties competently under impossible conditions was robust because it could absorb losses, adapt to failures, and continue functioning even when individual components failed. This was the nature of Malta's survival. Not one worker's idea, but an entire island's determination. Not a technical breakthrough, but systematic application of discipline and resource management. Not a dramatic moment of transformation, but months of grinding endurance during which every day survived was a small victory, and every convoy that reached Grand Harbour represented hope that the siege might eventually end. The siege did end, not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual shift in strategic circumstances. The Second Battle of El Alamein, in October and November 1942, broke Axis power in North Africa. The Anglo-American invasion of Northwest Africa in November opened a new front that forced Germany and Italy to divert resources. Malta's offensive operations, sustained by the supplies delivered in August, contributed directly to Axis supply failures that made defensive operations in North Africa increasingly difficult. By May 1943, when German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered, Malta was no longer under siege. The island that had come within weeks of starvation in August 1942 was now the launching point for the invasion of Sicily in July and Italy in September. The transformation from beleaguered fortress to offensive base required many factors: strategic developments in other theatres, industrial production increases that allowed more convoy escorts to be built, tactical innovations that made convoy defense more effective. But it also required that Malta survive long enough for those factors to matter. And Malta's survival during the critical April through August 1942 period depended on making inadequate resources sufficient through disciplined conservation and systematic prioritization. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.